Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Listeners, I'm always fascinated to learn about pathways to publication and the different ways Australian authors achieve their dreams of being a published author. And you'll all know from listening to this and many other writing-related podcasts that no two paths are ever the same. Moreover, success and longevity as a published writer can look wildly different between authors, publishing houses, and even within publishing houses. Now, I've spoken with writers who've been multi-published over many years with one traditional publisher, and others who've had to shop their manuscripts around every couple of years, then others for whom the traditional route has been paved with hits and misses, and others again who've turned to self-publishing to get their stories out into the world. All of which is to say that in this industry, it seems everything and anything is possible, especially when you speak with people like Pamela Cook. Pamela may be a familiar name to many of you listening in today. She's the author of 7 novels and several Christmas novellas, the host and producer of popular podcast Writes for Women, as well as a much in-demand and well-respected writing mentor and teacher. Pamela has been down the traditional publishing route, the indie route, and now I would say that she has managed to successfully venture back into traditional publishing in a sweet and satisfying plot twist, which I can't wait to share with you all today. So without further ado, welcome back to the podcast, Pamela.
Hi, Claudine. Thank you. That's such a lovely intro. And yeah, really interesting about the sweet and sour and coming full circle. So I'm excited to talk about all that.
I can't believe, and we were talking a little bit before we started recording, but it has been just over 6 years since we last chatted for the podcast. I'm mortified, but more mortified about how quickly time flies.
I know that is wild. I sat down today to write a newsletter for my Rights for Women Substack, and it's connected to everything we're talking about today. And when I thought, wow, it was 6 years ago that I first published this book, which means, it was probably 8 years ago that I first started writing it. It made me feel very, very old.
Oh, God. I totally hear you. But I mean, when I was thinking back over the last 6 years and, in the time that I've known you and we've become friends, lots of things have really changed for you since that time, haven't they?
Yes, wildly. Yeah.
Let's start off with one obvious one, that back in 2019, you were co-hosting Rights for Women, and now you do it all on your own. So I wondered if you could tell me what that's been like.
So I originally started Rights for Women with Kel Butler, and it was in fact Kel's idea, let's start a podcast. I'm like, yeah, great. But I'd never actually listened to one, so that was pretty crazy. But I tend to do those sort of impulsive things. And then, yeah, we were just Kel was developing a podcast business, and I was kind of going more into talking to writers about the writing process. We've always had a bit of a feminist angle to the podcast, but I was kind of going more down the writing process track. And so we decided to kind of part ways, and I continued on with the podcast, which has been really, really lovely because I've met, like you would understand, you meet so many fabulous writers. Even when you haven't met them in person, later on you'll talk to them in a podcast interview, and then you will invariably meet them down the track somewhere, and it's like them. So it's really kind of broadened my network within that writing community. And it's also just talking about writing and the writing process and the publishing industry with people at all different stages of their careers. It's just been so interesting, and I feel like I've learnt so much from that as well. It's been very time consuming, lots and lots of reading. So it has kind of forced me to read probably a lot more than I love reading, but you have to make time for it when you're doing it for the podcast. It's been a really, really worthwhile part of my whole kind of, I guess, writing persona, like it's writing adjacent, I think we like to call it. It's not actual writing. It's also a great procrastination tool in that, if I'm not writing, I can say, oh, well, I'm doing a podcast and that's to do with writing. But sometimes I do use it a little bit too much that way.
All of which I agree with. It can be a wonderful tool, and it does facilitate incredible connections and wonderful learning opportunities. But yes, also can be a procrastination tool and can take you away from the things that you want to do, especially when it becomes, as successful as Rights for Women has.
Yeah, and I guess it's just a matter of finding that balance. Like I did drop back this year from a weekly podcast format to a fortnightly one, which helped. I've brought in guest hosts over the years, as I know you have occasionally as well. That's helped. And that's always been great, I think, too, for audiences in that they're getting perspectives other than mine, not that I tend to talk that much on the podcast about myself, but I think it's just good to broaden out the range of people that listeners are hearing from. But who knows what will happen in the future with the podcast? It's something that I'm really, really proud of. And, I feel that it has contributed a lot to the kind of broader discussion about writing and publishing within the Australian writing community. But yeah, we'll see how it goes because I do need to get back to some writing at some
Mm-hmm.
point.
Now, talking about writing, I kind of got to know you first really as a writing teacher because that's actually how I first met you. You were teaching a writing course at Writing New South Wales, which I undertook. And I feel like in recent years, you've really leaned into this with retreats and workshops and self paced online courses, online teaching, mentoring, and more. So I wondered if you could tell me a little bit more about that and how on earth do you fit all of that in with your own creative practice?
Yeah, well, I do need to get better at balancing and juggling things, but I guess I came into writing after being a high school English teacher for many years, and I did a master's in creative writing and then just got kind of hooked on that process. But I think teaching is just kind of part of who I am. So it wasn't long after I'd done the masters and I thought, oh, maybe if I could teach writing to adults, because I was getting a little bit over teaching adolescents at that point anyway. I think that was because I had a house full of them at home at that point and it was like, too much. So I did start teaching at community college originally, and then that just gradually morphed into, I think I started doing courses at Writing New South Wales not long after I had my first book published, which was 13 years ago today. And then, yeah, I gradually thought, well, and I think part of it is to getting that confidence in yourself, even though I knew I could teach, getting that confidence in myself as, well, can I teach other people how to write? And I never believe that I'm actually teaching other people how to write. I'm helping them learn some skills that will assist them in accessing their creativity and in accessing their own ability to write. Because I believe we're all innately creative. Everyone has the capacity to create in some form. For some of us, we choose writing. For others, it's painting or art or photography. So it has been something that's just evolved, I think, over time. And then I think the mentoring probably came about just when people asked me, informally, oh, can you read this and give me some feedback? And it's something that, over the last few years in particular, I've really enjoyed that process of reading people's work because I think having written 7 novels now, 3 novellas, 8 novels, I've got another one in the drawer, and reading so much and all of those things we do as writers, that I don't know, I just seem to be able to pick up where things can maybe improve or suggest things. And I do think that I'm very conscious of giving that feedback in a constructive way. So I think people need to have things pointed out to them, but there's also a way that you can do that quite nicely and gently, without destroying someone. And I guess I know as a writer myself and having been on the other end of feedback, I know how hard it can be to receive it. So I'm always really conscious of making sure that I'm delivering that feedback in an appropriate way.
And I know from talking to a lot of other people who have experienced your wonderful techniques and suggestions that, you're obviously having success in this space and people are coming back for more.
It's always lovely to work with people, multiple times on one manuscript and then another and another. And that's not to say always that we have success in them necessarily getting that published. But I do think that, and I think we're going to talk about this, writing, if you want a writing career or if you want to be a published author, it's a long-term thing. You've got to really commit to being in it for the long haul and you've got to take the knocks and you've got to continue to learn and continue to grow as an author. Now there are so many different avenues for publication that I think it's probably more than ever, really, in the time that I've been involved in the business. It is getting tougher in some quarters to get your work across the line, perhaps with a traditional publisher. But there's lots of other avenues and smaller tiered publishers who are out there that I think are just giving more options for writers and for aspiring authors.
when we last chatted, you were about to release your fifth novel into the world, and that novel was Cross My Heart, a book which you have publicly said was rejected by your publisher and which you then
Hmm.
decided to publish yourself in what I would say was an incredibly bold and brave move. So I wondered, Pamela, if you could take us back to that time and your decision to self publish. What was driving you?
Interesting again, Claude, because I was just writing about this today, so it's very fresh in my mind. But I'd had four books traditionally published, and so one of those I'd gotten across the first one across the line through a manuscript development prize, and then the subsequent three books I was contracted for. So, I signed the contract before I wrote the book, sort of thing. I was very lucky. I consider myself very, very fortunate to have been in that position. I learnt a lot over that time. It was fantastic. And then when I handed in my fifth manuscript, it was rejected. And it was almost like a breakup, with my publisher because she and I, on a personal level, got on really, really well. And I know it was very hard for her to kind of say no. And it wasn't her saying no, it was, the kind of machine behind her, the sales team and that sort of thing. And I have talked about this publicly. It was partly because I was marketed in the rural romance sphere, even though my books aren't strictly romance. I did inject a bit more romance into them, but I tend to, I'm more a women's fiction writer and happen to be writing books set in the country. So it was kind of slotted into the rural romance. So I think for some readers who would have loved full on romance, they weren't going to get it from my books, and that so it could have been a little misleading. That market had declined a little bit at that time. The space was also very crowded. I mean, at that point, I was part of a rural romance writers website group, and I think there were like over 50 of us on that website at that time. So there were these books continuously coming out, so it was getting to be harder and harder to be kind of seen in that space. So yeah, I was pretty devastated, I have to say, after having, 6 years with that publisher and then getting that rejection. And then, I did the usual wallowing and all that sort of thing, the glass of wine in the bath and the tears and everything that we're allowed to do at that point. I did have an agent by then, so we did shop it around to some other publishers, got some lovely feedback, but again, all no's. One in particular pretty severe rejection, which did really actually throw me for six. It was that, why am I doing this? Who am I even to be teaching other people, about writing? And I went through a real slump there for a little while. And then I just thought, I really believed in the story. I just thought, I really want this story to be out in the world. I've worked really hard on it. I can, give up and go away and try something else. But then I'm kind of losing touch with all of that learning that I've done over the years about, and I felt that I was getting better in my writing with each book. So for me, it felt like it would be a real waste to just throw that away. And I'd had a few friends had self-published at that point, and I thought, okay, well, I'm going to give it a go. And I just kind of threw myself into learning everything I could about self-publishing. I wanted the book to look super professional, like every other book, on the shelf. So I did pay a fairly large amount for a really nice cover, paid for edit, great editor, and learnt all about formatting and all of that sort of stuff. Got people to help me with that and hired, different people to help with that process. So I ended up self-publishing that book and then subsequently self-published another book, which was one that I revised, that I had received the rights back for from my publisher, and I revised it, gave it a new title, and then self-published. So I ended up self-publishing two books over the course of a couple of years. And it was a fantastic learning experience. Like, I learnt so much about the publishing industry, certainly about that indie space, which just blew me away, and the people that are out there doing that day in, day out, and the amount of work that goes into it was just astounding.
Now, I know from speaking to you about this particular book back in 2019 that it was a story that you were deeply invested in. So I wondered if you could tell us more about the genesis of the story and why it meant so much to you.
Well, I mean, essentially, it's a story about mothers and daughters, I think. And I am a mother of three daughters. When I think back about all my books, there's usually a mother-daughter theme in there. And this particular story just came initially from a question, and it actually was something that I'd had forgotten, but it came from the original seed of it came from when I was a teenager, and there was a certain person that lived in the neighbourhood that was quite unsavoury. And there was a certain rumour going around about something that had happened in regards to this person. I'm being very careful what I say because I don't want to give away too much of the storyline. And it kind of astounded me that nothing had been done about this thing that was supposed to have happened, or that people, didn't know about. It was kind of this secret, but people knew about it. And it kind of raised this question for me, like, what if you had a secret, from your childhood or from your teenage years, and you didn't tell anyone, but then that kind of backfired on you, that not revealing the truth about a certain situation could have really dire consequences for someone? And I think that question just kind of lingered in the back of my mind for a long time. And when it came to write this particular story was kind of going into a bit darker territory, I think, than my previous novels. I'd always dealt with like grief and loss and family themes and friendship, but this one did go into a little bit of a darker issue, I think. And also, Claude, at the same, well, not at the same time, but just prior to that, in 2015, I lost my best friend to motor neurone disease, 10 years this year since she passed away. And so at the time, a couple of years later, when I was writing this book, I was very conscious of this idea of long-term friendship and what that means. And when you lose someone that you've been friends with, in that case, it was 40 years, but it's kind of the impact that those long-term friendships have on us, as people and how they help to form us. So there were kind of a few different questions floating around and they just, came together as they do.
This was an utterly beautiful story. As you said, a book about friendships, about trauma, about facing the past, about mother-daughter relationships, amongst other things. And we had a very in-depth conversation about the book in our first chat. So I don't propose that we go into any great detail about all the different themes and issues of the book again. But I wondered, for those who haven't heard about the book as yet, could you tell me a little bit more about the story?
Yeah, so it centres on a character called Tess DeSantis, who is a kind of urban professional. She's in her 30s and she is child free. She and her husband have decided not to have children. She's the youngest daughter in a family with a kind of Italian background. And so she's being the youngest and the baby. She's quite, spoiled a little bit by her parents. And she's got three older brothers who baby her a little bit. So she's got these kind of different personas, but she's got this long-term friendship with a woman called Skye Whitaker. But for reasons that you find out when you read the book, Tess and Skye have drifted as we do over time. And I think that was another thing I was exploring too, was that idea of, how you can be such great friends with someone, but then just not see them for years on end. But you still have that connection. Anyway, it's not a spoiler to say, because it does happen very early, and I think it's on the back of the book, that Skye dies in kind of mysterious circumstances. And Tess had been asked many years prior to be the godmother for Grace, Skye's daughter. Skye doesn't have any other relatives, any other living relatives. And so Tess gets a letter from the Department of Community Services, Family Services, to ask, will she take on this role of fostering Grace. Grace has been living with Skye on a very isolated property out in central west of New South Wales and is also not speaking. And so when Tess meets her, she doesn't know if that is a long-term thing or if it's a result of trauma. So the story kind of unfolds in that Tess goes to live with Grace on the property where she grew up with her mother, and certain things come out about Skye's past and about Tess's past with Skye that certainly explain a lot about what has happened to Skye and what is happening with Grace. There's also an equine therapy element where she then takes Grace along to equine therapy, and both of them, go through that process. It's a section I really, really enjoyed writing. As you know, Claude, I'm a big horse lover, and I did go and do some equine therapy myself to research that part of the book, which was fantastic.
Yeah, I must say that was one of the things that I most enjoyed about that book, because I knew nothing about equine therapy before I read that book. And I was fascinated to learn about its value and its place in helping to treat people who are suffering PTSD and various other traumas.
Yeah, well, I'd first kind of come across it. It was actually in a Good Weekend article after the 2009 bushfires, I think. And that was what I wrote, kind of based my first book on. But it always had stayed with me, this ability of horses to kind of just calm your nervous system. And interestingly, since I wrote Cross My Heart and published it in 2019, in that 6 years, I think it's always been a little bit on the woo-woo side, equine therapy, but I think it's becoming a much more accepted form of therapy. And it's certainly, since that time, I've seen quite a few documentaries on it, lots of news articles, read stories about the use of equine therapy and helping, kids with trauma, adults with trauma, people who've been through traumatic experiences, war veterans. So it's certainly becoming a lot more of an accepted therapy practice. It's a smaller part of the book, I think, overall, but it's certainly, integral to the overall story. Yeah.
So the reason for talking about this book again now is that 2025 has kind of brought you full circle in that Cross My Heart is actually being re-released in early December in all formats, not just here in Australia, but in the US and the UK, which I'm hugely excited by. So how did this happen? Tell me all about it.
Thanks, Claude. Yeah, it's been quite amazing actually. And you know, it's another one of those unexpected things that can happen to you if you just kind of look for opportunities, I guess, and be open to different ways of getting your books out there. So all of my books were released on audio by Belinda Audio couple of years ago. And then I got subsequently got the rights back from my traditional publisher for, you know, all of my backlist. And I kind of had them sitting there. I'd done the self-publishing thing, which I liked to some extent, but I knew that, you know, doing all the advertising and marketing and basically the business side of it was just not me. I just didn't want to spend time doing that. So I was kind of sitting on these books thinking, well, I want to get them out there, but I don't know how. And then I spoke to my agent and she said, oh, there's this new company starting up in the UK. It's just started up. She knew a guy, Mark Smith, who was the CEO of Vinci Books. And this was like probably about 18 months ago, I first had this conversation. And they basically work with indie authors who, like me, don't want to do all the business side, just want to do the writing. And they do everything else. So they do the, you know, they'll put covers on for you, they do the formatting. You've got to give them the completed, fully edited manuscript. And then they basically do everything else, including, you know, the uploading. And I guess the money that you would get maybe as an advance, you know, in the traditional space, that kind of money goes into Facebook and Amazon advertising. So they focus very much on ebook. You sign over the book in all formats if you sign with them generally, but they do also do print. And because they're kind of quite a new publishing company and a new model for publishing, they've been just slowly growing over the last few years, probably last 2 to 3 years, I think. Anyway, I thought, yeah, why not? I'll just, you know, if I don't want to put the books out there myself and do all that work, then this sounds like a great way to still get my books out there, you know, have the support of a publishing house and, you know, the credentials of all the people working for Vinci are outstanding. They've all worked in various traditional publishing houses and have great credentials in cross sales, marketing, editing, publishing, all of those areas. So yeah, I dived in and signed with them. And part of the deal that they have is that, well, I know certainly here in Australia. So here in Australia, they partner with Allen and Unwin as a distributor of their books in Australia because Vinci haven't got, you know, a kind of presence here as such. And yeah, and then I found out very kind of fortuitously not that long ago that Cross My Heart, which had already been given a beautiful new cover and they've recut jacketed all of my books with great covers that I love and really got the branding right, you know, that kind of women's fiction space, I think, for me. And it's coming out, it's going to be in QBD, Dimmicks, and Big W. So I think what happens is that Allen and Unwin kind of look at the backlist and go, okay, yeah, that's the one that we think we can put out in print here and sell some copies of, you know, which is really, really lovely for me that this is the book that got rejected by a traditional publisher and I've now got it being, you know, put out kind of thing by a traditional publisher or semi-traditional publisher. So it's been really, really lovely. Yeah.
A bit of vindication for you.
Yeah, yeah. And that's not to say that I had sour grapes or anything at all at the time that it wasn't published by my original publishing house. I, you know, certainly after, you know, getting over that rejection and certainly in the years after, I've really come to realize what a business the whole publishing industry is and that, you know, regardless of any personal connections you might have with your individual one-on-one publisher, that, you know, the publishing house is in it to make money and as they should be. You know, that's what they're there for. And they have to be able to see a viable audience and that they're going to not only get their money back, but make a profit, you know. I kind of understand that. And you know what? In a very weird way, I'm kind of glad that happened because I've learnt so much more going down the path that I've gone down than I would have if I'd just kind of stayed, you know, in my bubble. It would have been lovely maybe to stay in that bubble, you know, and be continue to be traditionally published. But certainly in terms of my learning and growth, it's been a much better experience, I think, doing it this way. And I think the other thing I've come to realize is that, you know, there are, as we know, there are so many books coming out all the time. And it's just not possible for all of us to be traditionally published. particularly I think in recent years with bookshop closures and, all of the pressures on reading, people not reading as much and all of that sort of thing. But it's just made me see that, there are so many other ways that you can get your story out there. And I really do think it's about being true to who you are as a writer, continuing to write the stories you want to write, because I think that authenticity comes through in the writing. And then at some point, somebody is going to see that, whether it's a reader or an editor or an agent, whatever, but also looking for new avenues to get your book out there.
So I just kind of wanted to go back and clarify something. So Vinci not only
Hmm.
bought your self-published titles, but your two audiobooks and your entire traditionally published backlist. And so when you talked about getting your rights back, and whilst I know what that means, I wondered if you could
Yeah.
tell us more about this, because I feel sure that there are authors listening in wondering how on earth you made that happen and why was
Yeah.
this important?
So when you sign a contract with a publisher, generally you're signing over, print, ebook, and audiobook rights, and often movie rights. Sometimes if you have an agent, they'll hold back film and television rights, for instance. In my case, I'd signed over all of my rights to my traditional publisher. And then when I was no longer being published in terms of having any new books out with them, they owned the copyright on all of those things for my backlist. I had on sold one audiobook to a UK company for my second published book, Essie's Way. But because, the books start to get a little bit older and obviously the publishing house is not really promoting them because they've got new books to promote, and you do as much as you can to continue promoting them. But, over time, they're just kind of sitting there. And there's usually a clause, a reversion clause within your contract, which is something like, if you sell, or in my case, it was something like if you sell less than 50 books per period. So it's about 100 books a year. Like if you sold less than 100 books a year. But because I was on the podcast and, part of the author community, and I guess I was selling marginally over that amount of each book each year. And so it was within the publisher's rights to say, no, we're going to keep the rights because the books are still selling, in inverted commas. Even though they weren't selling, you could maybe go and buy a couple of steaks with them once a month, but that'd be about it. And again, it was, I'd have conversations with my particular publisher about this, and she'd say, I know, but, anyway, I think it was a little bit like just water wearing down a stone, over time between me and my agent. And then gradually, the sales numbers did decrease over time. This is over years, a period of years. So I did get the rights back. And what that means is that then I had the right or permission to do whatever I wanted then with the books. I could self-publish them. I could, try and on-sell them to another publisher. The audio rights I got back first, and I did sell those to Belinda Audio. So they are or with Belinda rather than with Vinci because I'd already made that agreement before I signed with Vinci. And then, yeah, so I could have done what I did with Cross My Heart originally and just kind of rejacketed them and put new titles if I'd wanted or just new covers and put them out as an indie author. But yeah, I just decided I needed somebody else to kind of work with to do that. I've now then passed those rights on to Vinci. Yeah, it's quite a complicated process. It's hard because you kind of feel like, well, they're my stories and they're my books. But because you've signed that contract, you've basically given them your intellectual property. And it's a matter of getting that back and then thinking, okay, well, what do I want to do with it?
So when you signed with Vinci, like, did you have to go through another editorial process?
No. So part of the deal with Vinci is that you give them a completely edited manuscript. So you're kind of telling them, yes, this has been fully edited. They do have a quality control thing, so they read it and make sure that it's all proofread and all that sort of stuff. But then they do everything. So you're basically giving them the finished product. So I guess that's a cost where, like with a traditional publisher, you basically, well, generally how it works with the traditional publisher is that you give them the manuscript, you work with their editors to get it up to scratch, and they pay for that editorial. If you're an indie author, you pay for the editorial. That's what you need to do with Vinci. But then they do the cover design, the blurb. They've reblurbed all my books. They've rejacketed and they've put them into new formats. And then their big kind of push, I guess, is to really promote the books in ebook format. And it's really amazed me because that's another thing being with a traditional publisher, at least here in Australia. I think the emphasis there is still very much on print. They do put the books out in ebook format, but I think what they really want to see are print sales. Whereas a publisher like Vinci, who is working more on that online space, they're very much promoting ebook sales. And so they promote through Amazon, and they also work through KU, which is, the Amazon kind of membership process.
I think that is just a fascinating model, really, and so exciting for you in particular. And I've since learned of somebody else that we mutually know who's signed with Vinci, and I just think that's incredibly exciting. But again, since the last time we chatted, Pamela, you've also signed with HarperCollins as part of a group writing a Christmas story collection. And I think you've done what, three so far?
Three, yeah, I'm working on my fourth novella,
Oh,
which has also been a
amazing.
surprise.
All right. So tell us how this came about.
Well, that all came about through our mutual friend Penelope Janu. And Pen had been in a Christmas novella, and so it's an anthology. It's a collection of stories written by, we started off with five authors, and now there's four of us. And Pen had been in one back in, I don't know, let's say 2019 or 2020 or something. I don't know the exact year. And then she just said to me one day, "Oh, we should do some Christmas novellas, and I'll see if, we can get an anthology going with HQ." And I said, "Well, they're not going to take me because I'm not a HQ author." And all of the authors who had been in the previous one had been already HQ authors. But I did write, I guess, rural, fiction slash romance. And that was the kind of theme around that Penn was putting around the proposition. And sure enough, lovely publisher Joe Mackay agreed. And then I was in, and I've done three now. So it's been just a joy, working with Penny and Stella Quinn, Alyssa Callan, Renee Black this year. Lily Malone was in one. It's been amazing. And Claudine, I never thought I would write a novella. Like I didn't, again, a bit like the podcast, what's a novella? Because, I probably read one, but not something I would seek out to read. And I'd never written a Christmas themed story. So, yeah, it's been another bit of a learning curve, but it's great in that, if you really put your mind to it, you can knock over a 30,000 word novella within a fairly short frame of time. Not that that's happened this year. It's been dragging. But the one for this year is called A Country Practice Christmas. And we've previously had a country farm Christmas. Next year's one is a country pub Christmas. It's been a lot of fun, and they've been really well received, actually. And that's since we're doing them year in, year out. That's actually available now, and it seems to be selling pretty well again this year. So that's great.
I can tell listeners, as somebody who's read all of them over the last 3 years, and I'm a bit of a Grinch when it comes to Christmas because I can't accept that it's coming. And so it takes a lot for me to actually go and buy a Christmas themed book and to read a Christmas themed book, because then it really means that Christmas is just around the corner. It is a wonderful way of getting into the Christmas spirit, and I've really enjoyed all of your stories. And this year's story is called The Ghost of Christmas Past. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, so the original one I wrote, I think, I've got to think back now, was I thought I'd connect it to my Blackwater Lake stories. So Blackwater Lake was my first published novel and ended up accidentally kind of becoming a series of three books. And I thought, well, make it easy for myself, set the novella in a world that I know. So I did that. And then the next one was a little bit different. And this year, because again, kind of capitalizing, I guess, on the Vinci thing happening with the two follow-up books to Blackwater Lake coming out of the Ashes and A Place of Her Own, I thought I'll set it in the same world. And there was in A Place of Her Own, which is the third book in that series, which is the last book that I've actually, full-length novel that I've completed. There was a psychologist in there who was kind of on the sideline, a bit of a side character. And the theme for A Country Practice Christmas, of course, they had to be part of some kind of medical practice. So I thought, oh, bingo. So Hannah Rasmussen is the character, and she's kind of fairly new to the town. She's a city person who's moved to the country looking for a kind of fresh start. And I had this idea, and I decided, like you were saying about being a Grinch, I thought she's a bit of a Grinch about Christmas. And I thought, well, why is she a Grinch? And I kind of like to go back into the psychological wounds of my characters. So I started delving into that, and I thought, and for some reason, this whole idea of Grinch brought up the idea of A Christmas Carol for me, with Scrooge. And so I went back and I read A Christmas Carol. So it's kind of semi-inspired by A Christmas Carol in that, Scrooge had the three visitations from the ghost of Christmas past, present, and future. The story is called The Ghost of Christmas Past, but Hannah's experiences in terms of coming to terms with Christmas and getting over being a Grinch is really meeting people in real life. So she meets three different people in real life, one from her past, one from her present, and one that is kind of going to be her future, that help to change her perception of what Christmas is and to let go of some of the past reasons of why she doesn't like Christmas.
Yeah, I really loved the story. Oh, yes. I'm really looking forward to next year's anthology as well.
Well, I'm having a go at a rom-com for next year, Claude. It's a bit lighter. The one I wrote for last year, which was a country farm Christmas, was kind of a light romance with a few comedic elements, but I'm trying to push that a little bit further. I went to RWA this year, the Romance Writers Conference, and went to a session with Amy Andrews on writing a rom-com, and I thought, yeah, I'm going to try and push the envelope a little bit further in that direction and see how we go. So I'm a big fan of Emily Henry, and I'm trying to kind of go down that path with the novellas at least. And it's a nice kind of relief for me because some of my novels do have quite heavy themes in some ways, even though I always try and balance that out with some lighter moments as well. But it's nice to just do something a little bit different.
Given all of your experiences in the time since you were thinking about self-publishing crossed my heart, what do you think are your takeaways about the publishing industry, and what would you say to people who are struggling to find a home for their work?
Great question. I think that, as I said before, it's a business. And I think the sooner that you come to terms with that, the better. I think we all go into it a little bit starry-eyed in that, we've got this dream that we're chasing of having a published book and having our book on the shelf. And I don't want to diminish that in any way because it is amazing. It's amazing to see your book on a shelf and to have readers talk to you about, the stories that you've written. It is a fantastic experience. But I think the reality is that the traditional publishing industry is a business, and some of our books are going to get across the line, some of them aren't. But I think then we need to have plan B and maybe plan C and plan D. For me, it was I had to kind of go back and think about, well, what is it why am I doing this? I love writing, but I could just write here, in my caravan and never show it to anyone and, just do that kind of writing. But for me, it's kind of being part of a community, and I've loved being part of the Australian writing community, the Sydney-based writing community that we're involved with. Claudine is fantastic, and just going to people's book events and just supporting each other through different stages of publishing. I'm in a fantastic writing group, the Inkwell, where we've really supported each other through the ups and downs of it all. So for me, it came down to being part of that community and wanting to stay as part of that community. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I have to be published with a big five publisher, So I think you've got to get back to some joy of writing, or be able to find the joy in writing. If it just becomes a chore and hard work all the time, I mean, it is hard work. It's a discipline. And sometimes it's like, oh God, I really don't want to write that chapter, or review that scene or whatever. But overall, there's got to be a joy in it, and you've got to be getting something more out of it than just, making the deadline or, making a few sales. Because look, as we know, very few of us are going to make a lot of money out of writing books. There's some lucky Australian, not just lucky, but talented Australian authors and lucky. And I think most people you and I have spoken to on the podcast would all agree there is often an element of luck in being published. But yeah, I think just realizing that it's a business, working out for yourself why you are doing it, and then definitely being part of a community and kind of not just getting things from that community, but giving back to that community as well and being supportive of other authors. I just know from Rights for Women, I've got a small Substack community there, and we get together. We've got a write-in tonight, actually, and just being able to sit down and write together, is a joy. And you come away feeling so inspired and so glad to be part of it, that's an important part of it as well. So there's a whole lot of other things that you get from being a writer and being an author, apart from just getting your book on the shelf. Writing for me has been not just developing my creativity, but I think also learning things about myself, learning about how people function, how relationships function. I've learned so much through writing these stories and doing research and looking into the psychology of things. I've learned a lot about people and relationships through that. So that's been a really lovely bonus.
Pamela, it's no exaggeration for me to say that I admire not only your talent as a writer, but your tenacity and the belief you have in your stories, along with the desire to see your stories connect with readers. I want to say I wish you luck with these beautiful re-release stories, in particular Across My Heart. And thank you for sharing your wisdom and your journey with me today on Talking Aussie Books.
Oh, thanks so much, Claudine. That's lovely. And it's been great to chat to you again. Thanks for having me on.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading.